So today we're talking about Desperate Housewives, and I'm so excited for this video. We're going to talk about the good and the bad, and if the show has aged well. There was a very creepy and uncomfortable storyline introduced in season 2 that I want to discuss today, because we are focusing just on season 2 in today's video, but I have already reviewed season 1 as a whole, and I'll link that down in the description because I'm tracking my progress as I watch the show and give you guys updates as we go along, because trying to talk about everything in one video would be a lot. Normally I get bored when I'm binge watching stuff for reviews, but watching Desperate Housewives has been an absolute pleasure. I've been watching it day and night when I'm cooking. It's just always playing in the background and I'm thoroughly enjoying myself. But the mystery aspect of this season was definitely lacking compared to the first season's mystery, which was a lot more intricate and interesting, surrounding the neighbor who ended her own life. I'm just going to give you a quick summary about the problematic aspect of this season, and then we're going to get into an overall recap, going into all the nitty-gritty details. It did get a little bit ridiculous at points, especially when I compare it to season 1. It's a bit crazy. There was this whole insurance scam of Susan marrying her ex-husband Carl so she can get an operation done, which was a bit far-fetched. I noticed Susan's storylines being much weaker this season, especially because it seems like they didn't know what to do with her, so they had her dating her doctor and then going looking for her dad, and she's basically running around in circles. Bree becomes an alcoholic quite abruptly, and often it's done in a comedic way, but I don't think they handled it with as much sensitivity as they should have. I've heard that Bree and Gabby go through the most character development throughout the show, so I'm looking forward to seeing that happen if it does, but currently on season 2 there hasn't really been that much changing with any of the girls except for Bree. Susan and Lynette aren't really making any progress this season, especially Susan. They're not particularly growing or learning anything, and they don't seem that different from last season. With Lynette, for example, she had a lot of paranoia about her husband Tom cheating on her in season 1, and then in season 2 she's doing the exact same things, jumping to conclusions and assuming the worst of him rather than just talking to him, and it creates a lot of issues and drama that could have been easily resolved if she just listened to him and had a mature conversation. Bree is definitely the only one this season who actually learned from her past mistakes and changed for the better or for the worse, but you know, had some sort of fundamental shift in her character. It's boring if it's stagnant, and I want to see them go through the ups and downs, but Bree's actress definitely had the most to work with in season 2. Another thing I noticed that I hadn't really processed as much in season 1, but that was definitely obvious to me in season 2, is that the girls' friendships with each other is really complicated, because it's really strong in some aspects, like when they're going through a crisis, they're always there to lean on each other and support each other, but in other ways, the concept of female friendship in the show is very shaky. There are some moments of genuine friendship, like in season 1, Gabrielle was having money struggles and Bree chipped in to help her, but at other points, it's like the girls are just meeting up and hanging out, but not actually really connected to each other, and they say that they're friends. They're always chatting and leaning out the windows to say hi and doing all those things they should be doing, and obviously talking is at the heart of how women particularly relate to each other, because we love to have those emotional heart-to-heart conversations, because that's how we've been socialized for the most part. But what I always find odd about these women is that they could be going through these huge struggles or interpersonal crises and they don't tell each other about it. So it's like it's just happening in a vacuum for each of them, which is odd, because normally women do have those very personal, intimate conversations as a way of bonding and connecting to each other. Their friendship sometimes more seems like a way to pass the time. It's not always rooted in like a genuine love for each other, but it's really odd because at other points they go out of their way to support each other. I've just started season 3, and in season 3 the girls are really concerned about a man Bree's going to marry, and they're not afraid to tell her the stone cold truth about what they think, because they care about her and they don't want her to be in danger. In some ways the friendships are really convincing, and in other ways they're not. The show definitely though has an idea of keep your enemies closer, especially when it comes to Edie. In season 1, Susan only started bonding with Edie and getting closer to her because she felt guilty for burning Edie's house down, but it was nothing to do with her actually respecting Edie as a human and liking her. There are a lot of cliques in the show and exclusivity, almost as if the women are in high school even though they're adults, and Edie doesn't feel a part of that group or like they'd even want to include her. So she basically has to blackmail Susan into Susan letting her come round to play cards with them and spend time with them. And Edie makes a comment that if they were in high school, her and Susan definitely wouldn't have been friends because she was the weird outcast who everyone hated, and Susan would have been one of the preppy cheerleader types who would have completely ignored her. And that got me thinking about whether the show would be considered feminist or not. And honestly, yes and no. I think that it's really cool to show female characters who are struggling with losing their independence and identity after having kids because that's normal, and some of them also embrace their housewife role and they like being a homemaker, and it doesn't mean you're less of a woman because that's the path you've taken. In fact, it makes perfect sense to me. Overall, I'd say that the show does actually address a lot of feminist issues. Lynette is like the stereotypical mum who's overwhelmed and feels out of her depth, and Bree's like that traditional 1950s housewife who's excellent with baking and sewing and all those very traditionally feminine things. Susan's desperate for love and she basically can't function without a man, and all of those are stereotypes. But the show does go into some depth with critiquing stuff and making the women interesting characters that you want to root for. Lynette doesn't just want to be a mum because she has multiple identities and she still wants to work and be driven and have her own career. And as for Susan, she wasn't afraid to pursue Mike and go after what she wanted, or pursue Ron in season 2 when she started fancying him. It's not like the show's saying you have to be a housewife because that's the goal for every woman and you're not complete if you don't have it. It doesn't say that at all, because a lot of the women actually struggle with having kids or being a housewife, or their life is worse as a result. Like Bree, sure, is living out maybe some women's fantasies of having the perfect house and garden, but she has a totally destroyed relationship with her kids and they resent her and they really hate her this season in particular. It got way worse to the point that she almost has a nervous breakdown, which shows that sometimes being a housewife isn't all it's cracked up to be, and Lynette is just totally overworked. And the same goes for their marriages. Like, Susan is really giving up hope at points that she's going to find the guy she wants, and as for Bree, she dates George, he turns out to be a stalker, her husband Rex dies, and that whole relationship was just really not what she thought it would be or hoped it would be. So I love that the show doesn't just make out that being a housewife is the goal and the only way to be happy. And it is empowering in a lot of ways because we have a woman doing the voiceover narrations throughout the whole show, and it's cool to have a woman speaking for so much of it. There is definitely a big stereotype in society that women spend a lot of time talking and gossiping and bitching about stupid stuff that doesn't matter because they have nothing better to do. So it is really funny that Mary Alice is like the omniscient narrator, because she spends so much time from beyond the grave gossiping about them, giving updates. So it embraces the stereotype, but in quite a funny way. She knows the answers to the show's mysteries, but rather than giving the answers, she just spends the whole time gossiping about what her friends are up to, which I find really funny. Even though it's not perfect, I'm really enjoying it, and I feel like it has way less plot holes and inconsistencies than shows like Pretty Little Liars, where it truly is all over the place and they'll leave these massive questions unanswered for seasons on end. And Desperate Housewives is definitely way better at wrapping stuff up, which I really appreciate, especially after being such a fan of Pretty Little Liars for so long and then feeling really messed around, not having my questions answered, and it's really annoying. So I appreciate at least that for the most part Desperate Housewives does answer the questions. But even though I've given obviously a lot of positive feedback about this show, I have to say that my biggest issue with season 2 that really drags it down for me is the Applewhite family. One of the big criticisms people had about Desperate Housewives when it first came out was the lack of diversity. They realized they needed a black family because they didn't have one. So we've got Betty Applewhite. She moves into the street on Wisteria Lane with her 2 sons. And I have to say that as much as I loved season 2, whenever I was uncomfortable at any point, it was always some kind of scene involving Betty and her sons. The writers did a really bad job of fitting in Betty's storylines with the other women in the show and having them linked together. And it's especially evident when you realize that Betty was never really incorporated into the main clique with the other women. It felt as if Betty and her sons were on a completely different show, separated from anything that the main characters were doing. They hardly interact with anyone else on the lane, and you could definitely not call them friends. This mystery with the Applewhite family was meant to be some sort of substitute for the Mary Alice mystery in season 1. Betty has a lot of struggles with her sons, especially one of them who she's got locked up in the basement because he's, in her mind, dangerous, but also she wants to protect him. And if we were meant to care about that and how emotional this makes her, we don't, because she doesn't have an emotional connection to any of the other women, nor would any of them realize this was going on behind the scenes, so they couldn't exactly help her with it. At the end of season 2, the mystery is wrapped up and Betty just grabs her son, disappeared. There was no closure. It was extremely abrupt. And why wouldn't you keep them in the rest of the show? Why would you just make them appear in season 2 and then kick them out again? It just seems like such a token diversity gesture. What are they doing? Betty Applewhite keeps her son Caleb locked up in chains in the basement with the door locked. So she's meant to be motherly and caring in her own way through her being controlling and emotionally abusive. None of it made sense. She's saying, I'm caring and my son needs mental help, so I'm going to lock him up because I can't bear to lose him. But the minute things aren't working out, I'm more than happy to poison him. So she clearly doesn't care about him. She's very scheming and secretive and honestly nasty compared to the other women on the show, and it really stands out. Of course they have flaws, like Bree was really against her son being gay and stuff like that, so the women have their problems. Betty is definitely like the most hardcore and cold. And her son Caleb, who she keeps locked up, has this thing where he targets non-black women like Gabrielle, Bree, Melanie Foster, and that's obviously a hugely negative stereotype, again, about black guys pursuing white women in an aggressive, creepy way. And the other son, Matthew, I thought we had some hope with, and I was pleased about that because he seemed sweet and nice and caring and just like he wanted to move on with his life and actually get a job. His mum is very controlling towards him. She doesn't want him to have any freedom because she wants him to basically look after his brother full time, which is ruining Matthew's life. And as a result, I found him a very easy character to connect to. But then they go and screw over his character too by making him basically the main antagonist of season 2 and a liar because he was happy to throw his own brother Caleb under the bus for something he didn't do. He turns really violent towards the end of the show, and the fact that he was actually the guy who killed Melanie Foster and not his brother Caleb is so messed up. It doesn't make sense to me too that Matthew would kill Melanie in order to protect his family, to then being happy to run away with Danielle and murder her mother Bree in cold blood. Why would he be so desperate to run away with Danielle? Is she really that important and amazing? We never got any time spent on Matthew and Danielle's relationship, so it's not very believable that he would risk it all and be happy to kill her mother in order for them to be together. So his character's entirely ruined at the end because he's there pointing a gun at Bree. So he's aggressive. I don't know why he couldn't have just been a nice guy and ended up with Danielle at the end of the show like a normal couple would. And you realize how bad it is because there's this one scene where he's there making out with Danielle and then they hear Bree come in, so he hides under the bed, and then Bree realizes he's under the bed because she sees his hand, and then she turns to Danielle and says, "Why is there a black man in your room?" You wouldn't point to him being black. What has that Zach got to do with anything? As if him being black makes him threatening in some way or suspicious. The worst part is that at the end of the show, when Matthew's holding Bree at gunpoint, the police arrive because for some reason his mum calls the police on him, which, would she really do that? The police will probably not be gentle with Matthew. It could escalate badly and he could get hurt, but fine, she calls the police on him and he ends up getting shot in the chest by one of the officers and dies. That's so wrong. That scene actually made me feel sick because characters don't die that often in the show, and he didn't need to die like that. You totally could have kept him in the show rather than killing him after one season, and I just feel like that's really messed up to have him be shot by police. There have been other potential killers in the show that were about to go and hurt someone, and before they did it they were reasoned with or told to put the knife down or put the gun down, but the fact that he wasn't reasoned with and was just killed immediately is very suspicious to me. It's a shame because the idea for the Applewhite storyline is great. This suspicious family moving in, a dangerous son who needs to be kept away from society. If they wanted to do that, fine. I think they could have done it well. Don't cast the only black family in the show to fill those roles. Like, you can have a black family move in, but don't demonize all of them. That was for sure my biggest issue with season 2. It could have been handled and written way better, and it's a real shame because, like I said, the concept is really juicy and interesting. The whole family was done dirty. Having them just kicked out at the end of the season leaves a very sour taste in my mouth. They should have stuck around. They were brought in to be part of the main cast, so at least one of them should have stayed on. I've had my rant about that, but now I want to do a recap of what happens throughout season 2 and what I thought of the characters, which girl's my favorite and stuff like that. Let's start from the beginning. At the end of the previous season, Rex, Bree's husband, died because his medication was being tampered with by George. George is a pharmacist who has a big crush on Bree and wants to be with her, so he thought he needed to get her husband out the way. So Bree is really shaken up by Rex's death in season 2 and by the fact that she's now been widowed pretty young. She sets everything up for a decent funeral, and then Rex's mother-in-law arrives called Phyllis, and she's just a total attention seeker, and she's making the whole thing about her. Even though Bree lost her husband, it's not just Phyllis that lost her son, but she's a total drama queen. Carlos is back in prison and he finds out for sure that Gabrielle cheated on him with the gardener, so that affects their relationship for a while because Gabrielle doesn't seem that guilty about it at first. Susan and Mike live through Zach's hostage situation because Zach was keeping them at gunpoint intending to kill Mike because he knew that Mike had kidnapped his father Paul and held him hostage, so he thought he'd go and attack them, and Zach was slowly unraveling throughout season 1 anyway, and his mental state was not good. The whole reason Mike had even kidnapped his dad Paul earlier in the show was because he knew that Paul or his wife had killed Deidre, who was, I hope I'm saying her name right, who was actually Mike's girlfriend for a while, and the father of Deidre wanted answers about what was going on. Paul told him that he was actually Zach's biological father, and Mike ended up letting Paul go and not killing him. After Zach's little hostage situation, he actually escapes and no one knows where he's gone. Meanwhile, Susan finds out that her ex-husband Carl is dating Edie, and Susan is really upset by this because she feels like Edie's moving in on her life or something. Meanwhile, Lynette, the mum of 4, decides to go back to work, which means that she's leaving Tom with the kids as a stay-at-home dad. Susan, although she's rattled by Zach holding her hostage at gunpoint, and she doesn't like how Zach treated her daughter Julie, she loves Mike, and Zach's Mike's biological son, so obviously if she has any chance of dating Mike, she needs to get along with his biological son, and for sure Mike would want to bond with Zach and get to know him. She realizes that she would actually like to find Zach and know where he is. The next day she returns to the park and finds Zach lying on a bench there because he'd hurt his leg, and Susan actually manages to talk to him. She thinks of her daughter and how Zach was kind of creepy towards Julie and getting obsessed with her, and Susan realizes she actually doesn't want Zach there in her life at all, so she tells him to go to Utah and she gives him some money. She lets him go, and then she doesn't tell Mike about what she did. But later on, Mike actually ends up finding out about this, and he's obviously furious that she got involved and he dumps her. I'd say this is like their first proper breakup in the show. Zach searches for his father in Utah for a few weeks, but he eventually returns home home and actually sees his father, who'd moved back home. Zach then asks his father if he knows who his biological father is, which is obviously Mike the plumber who lives next door, but Paul pretends he doesn't know who the real father is. Days later, Paul goes to knock on Mike's door and he tells him that Zach has arrived home safe and sound, but he doesn't want Mike to be involved in Zach's life or trying to be a father to him, and it would be safer if Mike just stayed out of it. Meanwhile, Bree has started dating George. George is determined to actually get her and swoop in, especially now she's vulnerable after her husband's death. They check into a hotel together in season 2 as well, and she worries about people judging. Bree is clearly still performing a role for society and trying to be like the perfect woman, in the same way that Gabrielle symbolizes the stereotypes around beautiful women being vain and materialistic. Bree keeps trying to get intimate with George, but every time she does, she keeps getting these rashes, almost like she's subconsciously trying to stop herself from being with him, and she doesn't listen properly to these signs, unfortunately. Maybe if she trusted her intuition, stuff would have been better. But she asks George in the hotel if he can be a bit more patient with her because she's just not ready to sleep with him yet, and she's still getting over her ex-husband Rex because he died very recently. But George totally manipulates her and coerces her into having sex with him, which is really messed up. He's not understanding at all. He basically says he's been waiting his whole life for her and he doesn't think he can wait anymore, and giving her an ultimatum like, if you don't sleep with me over the next few days, I'm going to lose interest. And so Bree almost feels pressurized to please him, and the whole thing just made me feel sick. I just don't like that, and there are so many, especially guys out there, but girls too, who are really pressurizing when their partner isn't ready to have sex yet, or they feel entitled almost to that person's body, as if you should just do it on my timeline, and it's just not right. I loved the Bree and George storyline, and I thought it was one of the best parts of season 2, but I really don't like how quickly she rushed into this relationship with George, considering her husband had just died in the finale of the last episode, especially because Bree has a lot of societal ways that she does stuff and routines. Even after Rex died, she wanted to call the girls and tell them, and any normal person would just call them, but she thought, no, I can't call them. I'll wait till 9 o'clock the next morning and then call them on the dot because that seems more appropriate. She does everything according to like what she thinks she should do, so I seriously doubt that she would be so hasty to start dating George because she'd be like, what would the neighbors think, or whatever. It's just a little weird. Also, beforehand, she was never particularly interested in George and didn't really have those romantic feelings for him. The George storyline should have happened later in season 2. I think what they should have done is had her husband die at the end of season 1, and then they should have opened season 2 with her alcoholism storyline, so maybe she could have slipped into alcohol immediately because of her husband dying as a coping mechanism, which would have made more sense for it to be more immediate. And then she starts recovering from alcohol and then starts pursuing George or using him as a distraction from the alcohol, and that would have made more sense if they swapped it around rather than her dating George immediately and then falling into an alcohol problem. Him trying to get her to love him got really intense towards the end, and that's the sort of thing they totally could have saved for the season 2 finale. She was very easily pressurized into having sex with him, into getting engaged to him, and I know Bree can be a bit of a pushover, but that was just a little bit unbelievable to me that she would be so easily coerced by him. And also, he's not like the most smooth operator, by the way. He's pretty obviously dodgy, and I think it's odd that she couldn't see that because everyone else could. And also, again, I struggle to believe it. George is like known as the local loser. At his engagement shower with Bree, a lot of people were shocked that he could even land a woman. Knowing Bree and how important it is to her what other people think of her, I just doubt that she would be so happy to date this guy. I could just imagine her wanting some rich, successful husband, well up in society that people admire. George starts getting really possessive towards Bree, and he starts hurting people that are close to her or people that might be threats to their relationship in any way, even if it's just her psychologist. He doesn't care. He wants to get rid of them. And then an ex-girlfriend of his visits Bree and tells her that George is dangerous and was really possessive when they were together, that he'd torched her car, that he'd stalked her, that he'd slapped attacked her, and Bree doesn't believe her at the time, but after a while she starts to rethink it. She does this experiment where she tries to push George to see how he reacts when he's triggered, and he reacts really badly. He's not happy to let it go and he keeps pursuing her. There's a really funny scene where Bree's dinner party is interrupted by George trying to sing to her from outside and blasting music in the stereo. He was singing "Don't Give Up on Us." So she grabs her gun and goes up to the top floor and shoots down his speakers. She visits her doctor in the hospital, and then she learns that for sure George attacked her doctor and pushed him off a bridge, and this freaks Bree out, so she calls the police on George, and he realizes that he's going to be caught. So a few days later he calls her from a hotel room and says that he's overdosed on a bunch of pills, and if she cares about him at all then she should come and save him. So Bree does go up to his hotel room and she's going to call an ambulance because he's taken too many pills, and she's fully intending to, but she says she just needs to know whether he killed her husband and whether it was intentional or not. And George shows no remorse and says that whatever he did for her, and she probably secretly wanted him to anyway. So she actually doesn't call the ambulance and she just leaves him there to die and then quietly leaves. And I don't blame her, to be honest. I mean, he literally killed her husband. But the mistake she makes is that she confides this to her son Andrew, and he's looking for reasons to dislike her, especially because she was not accepting of him being gay in season 1. So her telling him this is obviously really bad. The show starts to address what happens when mums decide to return to work, because like I said, Lynette wants to get back into the workplace. Well, she doesn't want to, she's kind of forced to by her husband because he doesn't want to work anymore and he thinks that they should swap roles. She has a very unsympathetic boss, a female one, who's really inconsiderate of the fact that Lynette has kids at home that she needs to get back to. Her boss Nina definitely represents what women have to give up if they want to go into a male-dominated career field. But it's weird because everyone in season 1 was saying what a powerhouse Lynette was at her job before she had kids and how competent she was, but honestly she doesn't seem that competent at her job in season 2. She makes a lot of mistakes and often breaks that professionalism barrier, and also she complains a lot about how hard her life is, and I didn't mind in season 1 because honestly I just felt bad for the woman and she had too many kids. But in season 2 she's got the opportunity to at least spend some time away from the kids and work, but she's complaining just as much. I'm not saying you can't complain or have a good whinge every now and then, but she's just a very negative person, and I hope that she starts to be a bit less resentful and a bit more grateful for what she does have. Gabrielle decides that she's actually going to get pregnant. I thought it was cool that she was the only housewife on the show who didn't want to have kids and was happy to stay independent in that sense, but she knows it's what Carlos wants, so she gets pregnant. She ends up actually having a miscarriage because she falls down the stairs. Caleb escaped from the basement and he was just roaming around the street, and Betty and Matthew had discovered that Caleb escaped. And the funniest thing is I thought he would have gotten a bus and left, but he didn't want to go too far from home because he doesn't know the neighborhood, so he was just sneaking around people's houses and rummaging in their fridge for ice cream. Bless him. So he ended up in Gabrielle's house, he scared her, she fell down the stairs and she had a miscarriage. Caleb's still missing, so everyone's looking for him, and the neighborhood knows him as the local intruder, so they have him arrested by the police, and Betty and Matthew make a decision that they need to go and save Caleb. Carlos has been released from jail because he'd committed some crimes, so he's paying his dues and he's trying to be a better man. So he starts getting more into religious stuff and he starts bonding with this nun called Sister Mary. Gabrielle's a little suspicious because it seems like Sister Mary's trying to seduce Carlos, and he's a bit oblivious to it because he was like, she's a nun, why would she do that? But there's this rivalry between Gabrielle and the nun that happens for a while where they're kind of competing over Carlos's affection, which was very entertaining. Andrew's behavior is just getting worse and worse because he's still resentful against his mum Bree and still feels like she's the root of a lot of problems, including his father's death and her not being accepting of him being gay. So he invites his boyfriend Justin to spend the night and makes sure that Bree walks in on them the next morning. Meanwhile, Matthew and Betty manage to get into the hospital where Caleb's being kept, but there was another person there in the hospital looking for Caleb who's also disguised as a hospital employee. employee, and they follow Caleb and Matthew out to see where Caleb's being taken. A while later, Susan's trying to brainstorm ways for Mike and Zach to get together and bond as father and son, because she feels really guilty for sending Zach off to Utah, and she knows her and Mike have been broken up for a while and she's grieving that, but she just at least wants to feel like she's remedied it. So she arranges for them to go bowling with Julie and uses it as an opportunity for Mike to hang out with his son. But unfortunately, Paul finds out about the bowling and he gets really angry, so he goes over to threaten Mike and it escalates into a physical confrontation. That guy who was following the Applewhites turns up at their house where he saw Caleb being taken, and he goes in to try and remove Caleb from the house, and Caleb doesn't want to go, and then the guy falls through this gap in the stairs and dies. He was actually a hitman who was hired by the family of Melanie Foster to kill Caleb, because the family of Melanie Foster thought that Caleb had killed Melanie and they wanted some revenge. They dispose of his body in his car, but Matthew left the keys in the trunk, so they're forced to leave the car on the street for a while until they figure out what to do. While the body's in the car, Mike and Paul are obviously fighting on the street. Susan sees them fighting and she gets distracted and crashes her car. She crashes into the guy, the hitman's car, and so the boot opens. They see the dead body in the car and they all start to freak out and wonder who the murderer is. The storyline with Paul affects the Applewhite story and they collide, right? Meanwhile, Bree finds Matthew in Danielle's room and she freaks out because she doesn't trust the Applewhite family, and she certainly doesn't want her daughter to be dating Matthew, especially because after finding the body in the car, basically the whole neighborhood is suspicious of the Applewhites and think that it has something to do with them. Danielle's really upset because she actually really likes Matthew, and so she's crying in bed about it later, saying that everything is Bree's fault, and because she's miserable, she's trying to inflict that same misery on everyone else. And this is another clear indicator that Bree's life is really falling apart, because now it's not only her son that hates her, but it's her daughter too. Bree's trying to make amends, and so she says that maybe she'll buy Danielle pizza, and she agrees that it's okay for Danielle to date Matthew as long as there's some kind of supervision going on, which I honestly thought for Bree that was so much progress. So she goes to talk to Betty about it and sees Caleb through a window. So she calls her friends on the phone and she's like, oh my god, guys, you'll never believe what's up with the Applewhites. I think their son is this weird intruder breaking into people's houses. Danielle, her daughter, overhears, and because Danielle's dating Matthew, she gives him a heads up about what's going on and that his family secret might come out. And so Matthew tells his mum, Betty. Danielle mentions how Bree covered up a hit and run that Andrew was involved in. So before the poker game starts, Betty approaches Bree and threatens her and says, if you report my son to the police or anything like that, I have dirt on you and dirt on your son, so now we're even. Bree understands that, but she still wants more information about Caleb. So she gets a spare key and she ends up going into the house when Betty's out to talk to Caleb. And he tells her the reason he's been locked up is punishment because he hurt a girl called Melanie who died. A while later, when his mum comes home, Caleb informs her that a pretty redhead woman had come to see him that day. And Bree's basically the only redhead woman in the suburbs, so Betty knows exactly who he's talking about, and she goes to visit Bree to talk to her about it. She ends up telling Bree the story so Bree won't completely demonize her and will understand what was going on. So she says that Melanie Foster was actually Matthew's girlfriend. They'd been fighting a lot and they'd broken up. Caleb had called Melanie and asked to meet her in the lumber yard, and Caleb said that he wanted to be her boyfriend instead of Matthew, and Melanie obviously laughed in his face and she was like, I just dated your brother, you weirdo, I'm not gonna date you. And Caleb tried to kiss her and Melanie was like, what's wrong with you? And so she slapped him, and then he got really angry and he ended up hitting her really hard with this axe. Betty felt responsible because she hadn't protected him from himself. Bree processes that information, and a while later she goes to a dinner party at her friend Maxine's house, and she thinks it's odd that her friend can have prepared so much food that she's claiming to have cooked all by herself. But then the FBI arrives with a warrant to search Maxine's house, and they find a woman locked downstairs. She's a Chinese slave called Xiao Mei who's busy cooking. And this again was, I thought, a really racist subplot that just did not need to be there and could have been handled way better. Like, the constant reference to her being a slave is just really weird. And in general, the character is a very strange woman and her motivations make no sense, so it's clear they put absolutely no thought into it at all. Gabrielle and Carlos are asked if they can look after Xiao Mei, and she's currently awaiting plans to return to China. So Gabrielle at first is kind of hesitant, but she eventually says yes. One minute she's claiming that she loves Gabrielle and Carlos like they're her family, and the next minute she's going behind Gabrielle's back trying to seduce her husband Carlos. Zach discovers that Mike is his biological birth father, so he's very excited. Bree starts developing a drinking problem. Lynette asked her to babysit her kids, so Bree does, and they end up wandering out by themselves, and then she lies to Lynette about it and says that she was paying attention, she was just in the kitchen. But then Lynette looks through Bree's trash and finds like 12 alcohol bottles. Andrew starts using Bree's drinking problem as an opportunity to use it as leverage against her and make her feel guilty about stuff. But then he starts making up all kinds of lies about her abusing him so that he can get his trust fund early and get out of her hair, which Bree doesn't want to do because she feels like he's her son, he's under her roof, and she wants a chance to fix him. So she decides to go to Alcoholics Anonymous, not for herself, but just to seem like she's doing something and she's recovering and stuff, so that no one could say that she's not interested in bettering herself. So she starts going to this Alcoholics Anonymous thing, and she meets a guy there called Peter who was an addict of multiple things, and they start bonding and actually developing a kind of relationship. Bree is trying with Andrew in her own way. Like, she invites Andrew's boyfriend Justin over for dinner, but Andrew's just so resentful towards her because he wanted his money. Gabrielle and Carlos are still set on having a baby despite her miscarriage, but Gabrielle's got complications regarding getting pregnant and she's not sure if she'll ever be able to, so they just decide that instead they're going to adopt. But every possible thing that you could imagine going wrong goes wrong. They keep having issues, or someone doesn't want to give up their baby when they said they would, or they're seen as not fit parents because of Gabrielle having an affair with an underage gardener, and just things keep coming up. There's this little almost love triangle thing happening between Susan and these three guys who are all like her: Ron, the doctor, Mike, the plumber, and Carl, her ex-husband. They're all interested in her, and Carl keeps trying to ruin her relationship with Ron by having Ron and Mike fight. Ron seems like a really good love interest at first for Susan, but they kept trying to make him look bad and they turned him into a total douche. At one point he chose to tell Susan he loved her for the first time when she was under an anesthetic, so she was all loopy and not making any sense, and then he got mad at her when she didn't respond well, which I thought was so stupid, because how could you expect her to give a good answer when you're about to perform surgery on her and she's been drugged? So whatever, he behaved so childishly. At one point he attacked Mike, and then when Mike went to fight back he turned and ran in the opposite direction, so he was just such a loser. The others faced more genuine issues, like issues in the workplace in Lynette's case, miscarriage in Gabrielle's situation, alcoholism for Bree. They all had something going on, and Susan's just got these pointless arcs happening that are just sort of there. She literally just went on some bad dates and that was it. And the actress Teri Hatcher, who plays her, basically agreed. And when asked what Susan's arc has been, she said, "Susan hasn't had an arc. Marc has said it's been a giant problem from the beginning. They've sort of thrown some things up against the wall and tried to see if they'd stick, and they haven't. It's hard to invest in the arc of what you're trying to do with your work when you literally show up and there's no script to shoot. That's the way this year has gone." Which I agree with, because Susan was definitely the weakest out of all four of the women this season. Meanwhile, Edie's mad because she finds out about the marriage between Carl and Susan, so Carl proposes to Edie to try and impress her and throws her an engagement party. At the engagement party, Felicia, the neighbor, presents Edie and Carl with a gift, which is her sister Martha Huber's teeth, in the hope of reminding everyone that Paul killed her sister Martha, which is true. And so Paul felt publicly humiliated and basically left the party, which is awkward. But Paul Young's troubles with Felicia continued because she's still trying to avenge the fact that he murdered her sister. So he keeps tripping because she's leaving stuff on his steps. His lighter fluid is replaced with gasoline, so he almost burns his face off. And there was this hilarious scene where he woke up one morning to find that his entire house was covered in an exterminator's tent. And then Felicia appeared and said, "Oh, sorry, I gave the wrong address to the exterminator." Like, it's so funny. Can I just say, out of all the characters, I think Felicia's one of my favorites. Carl visits Susan and tells her that his engagement to Edie is off and he wants to be with Susan and he's in love with her. And Susan's really excited, so they hook up. And then the next morning, she figures out that Carl basically lied to her and he's still with Edie, which means that he's now tried to make Susan the other woman, and Susan's furious and kicks him out. And then he breaks up with Edie anyway. So Edie is sure that he cheated on her and she's determined to find out who with, and Susan's too ashamed to tell her the truth, but eventually she ends up writing a letter and posting it to Edie, basically apologizing and saying that she didn't know that Carl and Edie weren't broken up or she never would have slept with him, which I thought was honestly fair enough. But Edie gets so angry at Susan because she has this thing of wanting to compete with her, and then she burns Susan's house down. I was liking Edie's character a lot before this in season 1, and I thought that maybe she was just a bit misunderstood, but honestly she's a total bitch. And I don't care that Susan burned her house down in season 1, it doesn't matter, it was an accident. And I think that that's very different from intentionally, spitefully burning someone's house down. Carl's the perpetrator here, and the only person who should have their house burned down is Carl, because he was the one who lied to both of the women. Another thing I didn't like about season 2 is something that happens with Andrew, where they just take it way too far to try and show these power games going on between him and his mother. He invites over Bree's recovered addict boyfriend. He figures out that Peter's bisexual and they end up hooking up. Keep in mind, Andrew's, first of all, not 18 yet, and second of all, that's his mum's 50-year-old boyfriend. And then he makes sure that his mum comes home to find the two of them together. Bree's so devastated and angry that the next morning she drops Andrew off at this hotel place with money and his clothes and basically tells him to just go away. And I don't blame her, but I think the show took it way too far. That Andrew is like our main gay character in the show, and him coming out is associated with him being violent, sociopathic, aggressive, and vengeful. So I really hope that at the end of the show, Bree will be proud of Andrew and his identity, and Andrew will be proud of himself and his gay identity, because otherwise it's just very icky. Lynette is pissing me off because she places her kids in Mrs. McCluskey's care and follows Tom to Atlantic City, her husband, because she thinks that he's cheating on her, which is one of so many incidents where she thinks he's cheating on her when there's literally no evidence for it. And so she looks through the window and sees something that kind of looks like he's with someone, and she jumps to so many conclusions. And so she literally takes the kids and disappears. So when Tom gets home, he doesn't know where she is. And it's not that he was cheating on her, it's that he has another child from a one-night stand years ago, and he was trying to find out if it was true or not. And then Lynette goes and has a whole sob about it, like, "You put me through so much pain, you have no idea how much you scared me," as if it's his fault when she could have just asked him, "Hey hun, are you having an affair?" At the same time, Bree's having this birthday party for her daughter Danielle because she's been a bit out of it ever since she kicked Andrew out of home. She's a disaster, really, and she's getting really controlling, and her daughter, rather than being sympathetic, is being really mean about it and blaming her mum for everything. And so she says that she's going to take Matthew, her boyfriend, and run away from home for good. And that's when Bree realizes she's actually losing it and she thinks she's having a nervous breakdown. So she checks herself into like a mental health facility. Felicia Tillman is still planning her act of revenge on Paul Young. She was pumping out her own blood so that she could scatter it around his house as if he'd killed her. And she was calling the police to say that Paul was threatening her and making her scared. When Paul woke up in the middle of the night, he found her blood everywhere and 2 of her severed fingers, so she was trying to make it seem as if he'd assassinated her. So Paul ends up in prison, and he's going to need a lot of money for some very expensive lawyers, because first of all, he knows that he killed her sister, so he's already a murderer and should be in jail technically. And second of all, she's faked her death pretty convincingly, so he needs money. So he asks Zach to go to his biological grandfather, who's very rich with a lot of connections, to try and get some money. So Zach does. He goes to his grandfather, but his grandfather's being really rude about it and basically saying that he doesn't want to give them any money. And it seems like his grandfather's going to cut him off from inheriting his large estate. And so Zach gets really pissed off and kills Noah, his grandfather, brother by unplugging his breathing machine thing. We get a flashback to the night of Melanie Foster's murder in the finale, and we learn that Matthew had actually been the one to kill Melanie because he found her there unconscious after Caleb had hit her, but she was still alive. He was doing it from more of a place of trying to protect his brother than anything else. In the present day, Betty, his mum, finds out that he was the one who'd actually killed Melanie, and she's furious because obviously she was planning on killing Caleb. She'd been locking him up in the basement, but he wasn't actually the one to kill Melanie. I thought the finale of season 2 was amazing, and I enjoyed it just as much as the season 1 finale. I'll start with Gabrielle and Carlos and what happens to them in the finale. So Gabrielle finds out that Carlos was cheating on her with their live-in maid, but that really lacked emotional impact because her relationship with Carlos already seems quite shallow. She definitely wants someone to be more romantic with her. Like, she was really touched when John bought her a red rose in season 1 at the same time that Carlos had bought her a big flashy car. So maybe Carlos will become that romantic, soft guy. I hope that changes and he softens a bit, but I still don't like his character at the moment. While she's in the mental health facility, Bree meets this guy called Orson, who's a visitor. At the end of the episode, he goes and hits Mike with a car, so because Mike recognized him for some reason. So obviously this guy's a bit dodgy, but I know he'll start pursuing this relationship with Bree in season 3. She learns that Matthew was the real killer, and so she's really worried about him running off with her daughter Gabrielle without Gabrielle knowing the kind of guy he is. So she escapes from the hospital, which was iconic, and she runs back to home and she sees Matthew and Gabrielle there gathering their stuff, about to run away. Matthew whips out a gun and the police arrive and shoot him down. Betty and Caleb end up moving away to start afresh, and you don't even really see their reaction to their son or brother being murdered by the police. They just move out. Lynette really pissed me off in the finale. I wanted to say that she was my favorite character, but she's really aggravating me with this jumping to conclusions thing about cheating. But I can't say Gabrielle because she's still too shallow for me at the moment. And Susan, I really want to like Susan, but her storylines are just repetitive involving her love life, you know? So I actually don't know. I'm thinking Bree because I like her character development the most. It may change in the future, but thank you so much for watching, guys. I can't wait to review season 3. Follow me on Instagram and I will see you for the next video.